Sometimes the biggest fortunes are hidden inside the things everyone else is too proud to touch. The laughter began before Ethan Walker had even raised his bidding paddle. It rolled across the crowded salvage auction yard like a wave, bouncing off rusted hoods, cracked windshields, and rows of forgotten machines waiting for their final destination. The morning sun reflected off twisted chrome, while the smell of old motor oil and hot asphalt hung heavily in the late spring air outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. Mechanics folded their arms. Scrap dealers shook their heads. Even seasoned collectors exchanged amused smiles. Then Ethan quietly placed the winning bid. 17 abandoned vehicles. $2,500. Every one of them marked as non-running. Every one of them labeled beyond economical repair. For a long second, the auctioneer simply stared. "You sure about that, buddy?" he asked with an awkward grin. Ethan nodded once. "I'm sure." Pens scratched across paperwork while whispers spread faster than wildfire. He just bought 17 dead cars. Poor guy finally lost his mind. Guess that little garage of his is finished now. Ethan didn't answer a single comment. His weathered denim jacket carried the scent of engine grease that never completely washed away, and his worn work boots left dusty prints across the gravel as he signed the receipt. His hands were rough from years of rebuilding engines one bolt at a time, but they never trembled. Calm had become part of who he was. Across the auction yard stood Charlotte Hayes, the 36-year-old CEO of Hayes Automotive Group, surrounded by executives dressed in tailored suits despite the Oklahoma heat. She had arrived to inspect inventory for one of her company's recycling facilities, expecting another routine business trip. Instead, she found unexpected entertainment. She watched Ethan studying the line of broken vehicles with almost unsettling focus, as though he wasn't looking at scrap metal at all. She stepped closer, her polished heels crunching against loose gravel. "Excuse me," she called with a smile that looked friendly until you noticed her eyes. "Did you actually pay $2,500 for all of these?" Ethan looked toward her politely. "Yes, ma'am." Charlotte laughed softly, just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Congratulations," she said. "You just bought 17 pieces of junk." The crowd erupted again. Someone whistled. Another man clapped sarcastically. A young employee standing beside Charlotte chuckled. "That's probably the worst investment I've seen all year." Ethan simply glanced back at the vehicles. A faded pickup with a seized engine. 2 electric sedans covered in dust. An old hybrid crossover missing half its interior. Several forgotten prototypes no one cared enough to inspect. To everyone else, they looked like expensive mistakes. To Ethan, they looked strangely familiar. His blue eyes lingered on a tiny faded inspection sticker barely visible beneath years of dirt. Then another matching serial plate caught his attention on a completely different vehicle parked 3 rows away. His expression never changed, but something behind his eyes quietly awakened. Charlotte crossed her arms confidently. "Sometimes people confuse optimism with intelligence," she said. "Business doesn't reward hope. It rewards judgment." Ethan finally met her gaze. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. "Sometimes judgment comes too early." Charlotte smiled again, certain she had won the conversation. She turned away without another word, already telling one of her executives to remember the man's face because, in her opinion, every entrepreneur needed an example of what desperation looked like. Ethan waited until the laughter faded into the background before walking toward the first vehicle. He rested one hand lightly on its rusted fender as though greeting an old friend. Nobody noticed the faint numbers hidden beneath peeling paint. Nobody recognized the forgotten engineering codes stamped inside the damaged frame. Nobody realized those 17 broken vehicles had once belonged to the same confidential project abandoned years earlier. Nobody except the quiet single father standing alone in the Oklahoma sunlight. And within 30 days, the woman who laughed the loudest would discover that Ethan Walker had never purchased 17 dead cars. He had purchased 17 missing pieces of the same extraordinary puzzle. Ethan did not drive the 17 vehicles back to his garage. That would have cost more than he could spare. Instead, he rented the smallest flatbed trailer available, borrowed an aging pickup from his neighbor, and spent the next 2 days making careful trips between the auction yard and Walker Auto Repair, a weathered brick building on the edge of town where faded blue paint peeled from the sign above the entrance. It was not the kind of garage people noticed unless their car broke down nearby. The concrete floor carried decades of oil stains. Old shelves held carefully labeled boxes of bolts, sensors, and wiring harnesses that Ethan refused to throw away because experience had taught him that forgotten parts often found a second life. His 12-year-old daughter, Lily Walker, looked up from her homework as another battered vehicle rolled into the lot. "Did you really buy all of those?" she asked, her green eyes wide with disbelief and curiosity. Ethan smiled while shutting off the truck. "Every single one." She stepped outside, counting quietly until she reached 17. "Everybody online says you made a terrible mistake." Ethan laughed softly. The internet usually forms opinions faster than it gathers facts. Lily looked toward the row of silent vehicles. "Do you think they are wrong?" He rested a hand on her shoulder. "I think they are looking at the outside." Inside the garage, Ethan never reached for a wrench. Instead, he opened a worn notebook that had traveled with him for years. Every page contained neat sketches, electrical diagrams, handwritten calculations, and observations collected from thousands of hours spent studying vehicle systems. He walked from one automobile to the next, writing down identification numbers, inspecting connectors, photographing damaged modules, and marking tiny manufacturing symbols hidden beneath layers of dust. He ignored dented doors, cracked glass, and faded paint because those were distractions. What interested him lived underneath. Outside, customers slowed their cars just enough to stare before driving away. One man stopped long enough to shake his head. "Looks like a scrapyard now," he muttered before leaving. Business remained painfully quiet that afternoon. Only one routine oil change came through the shop, barely enough to cover utilities for another week. Ethan never complained. He simply continued making notes while the afternoon sunlight stretched across the garage floor in long golden lines. Across town, Charlotte Hayes reviewed quarterly reports inside her company's modern headquarters. During a break between meetings, one of her marketing managers smiled while holding up a tablet. "The auction story is spreading," he said. Charlotte accepted the device. A local business page had posted photographs of Ethan standing beside the line of abandoned vehicles. Thousands of comments had already appeared. Some called him determined. Most called him foolish. Charlotte gave a quiet laugh. People need reminders that confidence without expertise can become expensive. She handed the tablet back and returned to her presentation without another thought. Meanwhile, Ethan reached the oldest electric sedan in the lineup. Its battery pack had failed years earlier, but that was not what caught his attention. Hidden behind a damaged access panel was a faded inspection seal stamped with the initials APX. His breathing slowed. He walked immediately to another vehicle and found the same marking. Then another, and another. 17 vehicles. The same forgotten code. Ethan closed his notebook without saying a word. Lily noticed the change in his expression. "Dad?" she asked quietly. He looked at the row of silent machines, and for the first time since the auction, a faint smile appeared that carried something deeper than hope. It carried recognition. The following morning arrived with a cool breeze drifting through the open garage door while the first rays of sunlight illuminated the silent row of forgotten automobiles. Most people would have seen rust, cracked plastic, and faded paint. Ethan Walker saw a pattern. He carried his notebook from one vehicle to another with quiet patience, carefully removing trim panels instead of engines, lifting carpets instead of hoods, and photographing every hidden identification label he could find. Lily watched from a rolling shop stool, organizing screws into small containers exactly the way her father had taught her. "You are not fixing them," she finally said. Ethan smiled without looking up. "Not yet." She tilted her head. "Then what are you looking for?" He held up a weathered electronic control module no larger than a hardcover book. "Answers." The module appeared ordinary, but the tiny serial number stamped into one corner matched another unit he had removed an hour earlier from a completely different vehicle. By lunchtime, 5 matching components rested neatly on his workbench. By late afternoon, there were 11. None of the automobiles shared the same manufacturer, model year, or body style. Yet hidden beneath years of neglect, they all carried pieces built to an identical engineering standard. Ethan opened another notebook from a locked cabinet, its pages yellowed with age. He compared diagrams, traced electrical pathways with a pencil, and quietly circled symbols that no one else would have recognized. Lily leaned closer. "Have you seen those before?" He paused for several seconds before answering. "A long time ago. Outside, another customer slowed his pickup truck, stared at the growing collection of vehicles, then drove away without stopping. The rumors spreading across town had become stronger than any advertisement Ethan could afford. People believed the little garage was finished. Some even joked that he would soon be selling scrap metal by the pound. Ethan never responded. Every minute spent arguing would have stolen a minute from discovering the truth. Meanwhile, Charlotte Hayes stood inside the glass conference room at Hayes Automotive Group reviewing acquisition proposals worth millions of dollars. During the meeting, one executive mentioned that local social media continued discussing the mechanic who had purchased the abandoned vehicles. Charlotte barely looked up from her reports. "Give it another week," she said confidently. "People always stop talking once reality catches up." Everyone nodded. The conversation moved on. Back at the garage, reality was moving in a very different direction. As evening settled across Tulsa, warm orange lights spilled through dusty windows while insects hummed outside beneath the fading sky. Ethan removed a damaged panel from the oldest electric sedan and discovered something hidden beneath the insulation. It was not expensive. It was not shiny. It was a small titanium plate engraved with 3 simple letters. APX. His heartbeat slowed. He walked quickly to another vehicle and removed the same panel. Another plate. Then another. 17 automobiles. 17 identical markings. Lily noticed the sudden change in her father's expression. "Dad?" she whispered. "What does it mean?" Ethan looked across the quiet garage where forgotten machines waited beneath decades of dust. His voice remained calm, but it carried a certainty that had been missing for years. "It means these cars were never strangers." He gently closed his notebook, his eyes lingering on the matching codes. Somewhere in the past, someone had scattered a single masterpiece into 17 forgotten pieces, believing nobody would ever put them back together again. They had underestimated one quiet mechanic who had spent his entire life noticing what everyone else ignored. The days settled into a quiet rhythm that only Ethan and Lily seemed to understand. Before sunrise, the garage lights flickered on. Long after the neighboring businesses closed, the warm glow still spilled through the dusty front windows. Ethan rarely touched a wrench unless he already knew exactly why he was reaching for it. Instead, he spent hours comparing circuit boards, measuring connectors, cleaning corrosion from forgotten modules, and arranging every recovered component across a large plywood table until the collection resembled pieces of an enormous puzzle. Lily updated a handwritten chart on the wall, carefully drawing lines between matching serial numbers while soft country music played from an old radio in the corner. "This one belongs with the silver sedan," she said one evening. Ethan looked over her shoulder and smiled. "Good eye." She grinned. "I learned from the best." Outside the garage, however, the story was very different. Local business. Blogs continued sharing photographs of the strange collection of abandoned vehicles parked behind Walker Auto Repair. Comment sections filled with jokes. Some people wondered if Ethan had started a recycling yard. Others claimed he was chasing impossible dreams because he could not accept reality. The attention eventually reached a regional business podcast, where one host laughed while displaying an aerial photograph of the garage. "This," he joked, "is why financial decisions should never be based on optimism alone." Hundreds of listeners shared the clip before sunset. At Hayes Automotive Group headquarters, Charlotte Hayes was preparing for an investor presentation when her communications director entered carrying a tablet. "You should probably see this," he said. Charlotte watched the short video, smiling politely as the hosts mocked the growing collection of broken vehicles. When it ended, she leaned back in her chair. "Interesting," she said. "People are fascinated by confidence even when it is misplaced." The director asked, "Should we ignore it?" Charlotte considered the question for a moment before answering. "Actually, schedule a short interview tomorrow. Investors appreciate practical lessons. If people want an example of emotional decision-making, this story works perfectly." The next afternoon, standing before cameras inside her company's state-of-the-art innovation center, Charlotte answered questions about market trends and sustainable transportation. Near the end of the interview, the reporter mentioned the local mechanic whose unusual purchase had become a popular conversation across Oklahoma. Charlotte smiled with complete confidence. Successful businesses are built on careful analysis, not sentimental instincts. Every asset has a measurable value. Sometimes people see treasure where only expenses exist. Her words spread quickly online. By evening, the interview had accumulated thousands of views. Ethan never watched it. His attention remained fixed on the workbench where 17 electronic modules rested in perfect order. As he gently cleaned another connector, he discovered faint alignment marks etched into the metal housing. Individually, they appeared meaningless. Together, they formed a sequence. He quietly arranged the modules across the table according to those markings instead of their original vehicles. Lily looked at the new pattern and frowned. That is different. Ethan nodded slowly. Because whoever built this never intended the pieces to stay separated. He connected two modules using temporary wiring and open diagnostic software on an aging laptop that had survived more than a decade inside the garage. For several silent seconds, nothing happened. Then a small green indicator appeared on the screen. It was only one light, only one signal. Yet it confirmed something that every expert, every executive, and every critic had overlooked. The 17 forgotten vehicles were not random failures. They had been designed to complete one another all along. The green indicator remained illuminated for only a few seconds before fading from the screen, yet Ethan did not need it to stay any longer. One successful signal was enough to confirm that his instincts had been right from the beginning. He leaned back in his old wooden chair and quietly closed his eyes. Across the workbench, Lily watched him with growing excitement. "It worked, did it not?" she asked. Ethan opened his eyes and smiled with a calm confidence she had not seen in years. "It worked exactly the way I hoped it would." She looked at the scattered components covering nearly every inch of the table. "So what happens now?" Ethan gently picked up the notebook that had followed him through countless seasons of his life. "Now we stop looking at 17 broken cars and start building one complete system." The following days became a test of patience rather than strength. Before sunrise, Ethan carefully removed battery management units from one vehicle, cooling assemblies from another, power distribution hardware from a third, and precision sensors from several more. Nothing was rushed. Every connector was cleaned by hand. Every wire was tested individually. Every damaged seal was replaced before another part was installed. Lily carefully labeled storage bins while reading serial numbers aloud, her voice echoing softly through the quiet garage. Outside, summer rain tapped against the metal roof as passing traffic slowed to glance at the unusual project. Few people stopped anymore. Most had already decided how the story would end. Financial pressure quietly surrounded the little garage like an approaching storm. Bills continued arriving. Customer traffic remained slow. Ethan's savings had nearly disappeared after the auction purchase. Even the electric company mailed a friendly reminder that payment was due within the week. Lily noticed the unopened envelope sitting beside the coffee maker. "Are we going to be all right?" she asked one evening while helping sweep the floor. Ethan looked around the garage where decades of honest work lived inside, every tool hanging neatly on the wall. "We have enough for today," he answered. "Tomorrow will take care of itself once we do today's work well." His calmness settled her fears more effectively than any promise could have. Late that night, after Lily had fallen asleep on the small couch in the office wrapped beneath an old quilt that had once belonged to her mother, Ethan remained alone beneath the fluorescent lights. The garage had grown completely silent except for the gentle hum of diagnostic equipment. He connected another series of modules, adjusted several software parameters, and slowly uploaded a program hidden inside an encrypted backup drive that had not been opened in years. The progress bar moved across the screen with agonizing slowness. 10%, 28%, 54%. Ethan never looked away. Finally, the upload completed. The monitor displayed a simple message. "Prototype configuration accepted." Ethan quietly exhaled. No celebration, no raised fist, no dramatic words, only gratitude. He gently rested one hand on the unfinished assembly sitting before him. At Hayes Automotive Group, Charlotte Hayes was finishing another successful day filled with investor meetings, expansion plans, and optimistic forecasts. She had completely forgotten about the quiet mechanic whose strange purchase had briefly entertained the local news cycle. To her, the story had already reached its predictable conclusion. Meanwhile, inside the modest garage on the edge of town, something remarkable had just happened. 17 forgotten machines had finally begun speaking the same language again, and for the first time in many years, Ethan no longer felt like he was rebuilding old cars. He was restoring an idea that the world had abandoned long before it had ever been given the chance to prove what it could become. By the 23rd day, the garage no longer looked like a place where old automobiles came to fade away. It looked like a workshop where forgotten ideas were quietly finding their way back to life. Every workbench was covered with carefully arranged components. Colored tags hung from wiring harnesses. Handwritten diagrams filled an entire wall beside the tool cabinet. Ethan Walker moved through the room with steady purpose, never wasting a single motion. Lily had learned to anticipate what he needed before he even asked. She handed him torque wrenches, recorded voltage readings, and updated the growing notebook that now documented every successful test. "Ready for another system check?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Let us see if they still remember how to work together." He connected the final cable between the restored battery management assembly and the rebuilt control unit. The laptop screen flickered once. Diagnostic lines scrolled across the display. One by one, every subsystem reported healthy communication. Cooling system connected. Power distribution verified. Sensor network synchronized. Then came the message Ethan had been hoping to see for weeks. Integrated architecture successfully restored. He did not celebrate. Instead, he quietly leaned back and looked toward the ceiling, allowing himself one slow breath. Lily noticed the moisture gathering in his eyes. "Dad?" she whispered. He smiled gently. "Some dreams just take longer than people expect." They rolled the partially restored prototype into the open service bay. It was assembled from carefully selected pieces taken from the 17 abandoned vehicles, yet it no longer resembled any one of them. It had become something entirely different. Ethan carefully activated the master switch. A quiet electronic hum filled the garage. Soft indicator lights illuminated across the dashboard in perfect sequence. No warning messages appeared. No fault codes flashed across the screen. The entire system woke up exactly as the original engineers had intended years earlier. Lily covered her mouth in amazement. "It is alive." Ethan nodded quietly. It was never dead. It was only incomplete. Across town, a delivery driver stopped at the garage to drop off replacement connectors. Before leaving, he noticed the unusual vehicle sitting inside the service bay. "Mind if I take a picture?" he asked. Ethan shrugged politely. "As long as you do not get in the way." The driver snapped a single photograph and shared it with a caption that read, "I think the mechanic everyone laughed at might actually be building something incredible." Within hours, thousands of people had viewed the image. Amateur mechanics began enlarging the photograph, trying to identify the unfamiliar components. Automotive forums filled with speculation. Engineers questioned how hardware from so many unrelated vehicles could communicate as one integrated platform. Several experts insisted the picture had been digitally edited because such compatibility should not have been possible. Others simply admitted they could not explain what they were seeing. The conversation spread far beyond Oklahoma. Inside the executive offices of Hayes Automotive Group, Charlotte Hayes noticed the growing discussion while reviewing industry updates. At first, she assumed it was another passing internet rumor. Then she zoomed in on the photograph. Her confident expression slowly faded. She recognized one of the prototype modules immediately because her company had unsuccessfully attempted to purchase similar technology years earlier. She enlarged the image again, studying the unusual arrangement of components with increasing concentration. "That cannot be right," she murmured. Her chief technology officer stepped closer and quietly examined the screen. After several long seconds, he looked at Charlotte with genuine concern. "If this picture is authentic," he said softly, "whoever assembled that system understands technology that most manufacturers abandoned years ago." For the first time since the auction, Charlotte stopped thinking about the quiet mechanic as an amusing story. She started wondering who Ethan Walker really was. Charlotte Hayes canceled 2 meetings before noon, something her executive assistant could not remember happening in years. She remained seated in her office, the enlarged photograph still glowing on the wall display. Every time she examined it, another detail disturbed her confidence. The arrangement of the modules was too deliberate. The wiring pathways ignored conventional layouts, yet somehow achieved perfect efficiency. Whoever had assembled the system understood the architecture from the inside rather than through manuals or public documentation. "I want everything we have on Ethan Walker," she said calmly. Her chief technology officer hesitated. "Everything?" Charlotte looked up. "Employment records, patent databases, engineering conferences, university archives, anything. Within hours, researchers began searching through public records stretching back more than 20 years. The first results seemed ordinary. Ethan owned a small repair shop. He had no active patents, no recent publications, no corporate affiliations. The file appeared almost empty. Then one analyst uncovered an archived engineering symposium from more than a decade earlier. The presentation list included a young systems engineer named Ethan Walker. Charlotte frowned. "Open it." A grainy photograph filled the screen. The younger Ethan stood beside a whiteboard covered with electrical diagrams. His appearance had changed, but his calm eyes had not. The presentation title immediately caught Charlotte's attention. Adaptive Modular Vehicle Integration Architecture. Her chief technology officer slowly leaned forward. "That is impossible." Charlotte looked toward him. "Why?" He swallowed before answering. "Because that concept became the foundation of Project Apex." The room suddenly grew very quiet. Charlotte remembered the name immediately. Project Apex had once been considered one of the most ambitious automotive research programs in the country. Several manufacturers had quietly invested enormous resources. Before the initiative disappeared without explanation, most people believed the technology had failed. "Continue," she said softly. Another document appeared. Ethan Walker had not merely attended the program. He had been one of its lead systems engineers during the earliest development phase. Charlotte stared at the screen in disbelief. Why did he leave? The analyst searched another archive before answering. There is no record of disciplinary action or termination. He resigned voluntarily several months before the project was suspended. Her chief technology officer slowly removed his glasses. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "the modules in that photograph are not random salvage parts. They are prototype hardware from Project Apex." She looked back at the enlarged image from the garage. Suddenly, the 17 abandoned vehicles no longer appeared worthless. They looked carefully selected. She remembered Ethan's calm voice at the auction. "Sometimes judgment comes too early." The sentence echoed through her thoughts with uncomfortable clarity. Across town, Ethan noticed none of the growing attention surrounding his work. He and Lily were focused on another series of tests inside the garage. She read diagnostic values while he adjusted software parameters with patient precision. "Everything is stable," Lily said with an excited smile. Ethan nodded. "Run the synchronization sequence one more time." A soft electronic tone sounded from the rebuilt system. Every indicator remained green. Lily laughed quietly. "I think it likes us." Ethan smiled. "Machines do not care who owns them. They only respond to understanding." At that very moment, Charlotte received one final report from her research team. Buried inside an old engineering newsletter was a single sentence describing Ethan Walker as the principal architect behind the modular integration strategy later adopted by Project Apex. Charlotte slowly lowered the tablet onto her desk. For nearly a month, she had believed a struggling mechanic had stumbled into an expensive mistake. Now she understood something far more unsettling. Ethan Walker had never been guessing. He had been remembering. The morning of the 30th. Day arrived beneath a clear Oklahoma sky, and the little garage that had been ignored for weeks suddenly felt unusually quiet. Ethan Walker stood beside the completed prototype with a clean shop towel folded neatly over one shoulder. The vehicle no longer resembled the collection of forgotten machines that had once filled the lot. It carried the same modest exterior, but beneath its body rested a carefully restored architecture that had waited years for someone to understand it again. Lily walked slowly around the car, smiling every time another indicator light completed its self-check. "Do you think people are finally going to believe you?" she asked. Ethan looked at the reflection of the morning sun across the windshield. "Belief has never been the goal," he answered. "Understanding is." Before either of them could say another word, the sound of several vehicles approached from the road. Dark executive sedans rolled quietly into the gravel parking lot, stopping without unnecessary drama. Employees from neighboring businesses glanced through their windows, wondering why expensive corporate cars had arrived at the old repair shop. The rear door of the first sedan opened, and Charlotte Hayes stepped onto the gravel alone. There were no cameras, no reporters, no investors. She had chosen to leave every symbol of authority behind except her own presence. Ethan simply nodded politely as she approached. "Good morning," he said. Charlotte looked around the garage before answering. The place smelled faintly of machine oil, fresh coffee, and newly cleaned metal. Every tool rested exactly where it belonged. Every workbench reflected quiet discipline rather than chaos. She realized she had expected something entirely different. "I owe you an apology," she said softly. Ethan remained silent. Charlotte continued. "I believed I understood what you had purchased because I believed I understood value. I was wrong." Lily quietly stepped back, sensing that this conversation belonged to the adults. Charlotte slowly walked toward the prototype, careful not to touch anything without permission. "Project Apex," she whispered. Ethan nodded once. It deserved a better ending. Charlotte looked at him with genuine curiosity. "Why did you leave?" Ethan rested both hands on the workbench. "Because the project stopped being about solving problems. It became about protecting investments and winning arguments. Good ideas cannot survive very long when pride becomes more important than purpose." His words carried no bitterness, only quiet acceptance. Charlotte lowered her eyes for a moment. She finally understood why every investigation had described Ethan as brilliant, but had never explained his disappearance. He had walked away before ambition had buried the dream completely. She looked back toward the prototype. "Our company would like to partner with you," she said carefully. "We can provide laboratories, engineers, manufacturing facilities, anything you need." Ethan smiled kindly. "You already have excellent engineers." Charlotte looked surprised. "Then what do you need?" Ethan glanced toward Lily, who was quietly organizing notebooks beside the office door. "Time. Honesty. People willing to ask whether something should be built before asking how much money it can make." Charlotte stood quietly as his words settled into the silence of the garage. She realized she had come expecting a negotiation. Instead, she had received a lesson she could not purchase. Just then, Lily turned the ignition switch. The restored system awakened with a smooth, confident hum that filled the garage without strain or noise. Every display illuminated perfectly. No warning lights appeared. No hesitation interrupted the sequence. Charlotte watched the dashboard complete its startup routine, and for several long seconds nobody spoke. The silence inside the little garage carried more respect than every laugh that had echoed across the auction yard 30 days earlier. The weeks that followed changed the little garage in ways Ethan Walker had never imagined. Yet the first thing visitors noticed was not the restored prototype parked inside the service bay. It was the quiet atmosphere that had always lived there. The smell of fresh coffee still drifted through the building every morning. The old wooden workbench remained covered with neatly organized tools instead of expensive decorations. Lily still swept the floor before opening her school books in the office, and Ethan still greeted every customer with the same calm smile, whether they arrived in a 20-year-old pickup truck or a luxury sedan. The difference was that people now came from across the country to see the man who had quietly restored a project the industry believed had been lost forever. Engineers asked thoughtful questions. University professors requested permission to study the modular architecture. Young mechanics stood patiently outside the garage, hoping to shake Ethan's hand or simply watch him work for a few minutes. He welcomed every visitor with the same humility that had carried him through the hardest days. One afternoon, Charlotte Hayes returned, this time carrying no contracts and no corporate proposals. Instead, she brought a framed document. "Our board voted unanimously," she said. "We are establishing the Walker Engineering Fellowship. Every year it will support young mechanics and engineers who believe that character matters as much as talent." Ethan accepted the frame with genuine gratitude. "That will help people long after this project is forgotten," he replied. Charlotte smiled gently. "I do not think this project will be forgotten, but I hope the lesson behind it never is." Several days later, she stood before employees at Hayes Automotive Group and publicly addressed the story that had spread across the industry. She admitted that she had judged a person before understanding his knowledge, and she reminded every executive in the room that leadership required curiosity before confidence. The applause that followed was respectful rather than enthusiastic because everyone understood the honesty behind her words. Back at the garage, life continued at its familiar pace. Ethan declined offers to sell exclusive rights to the restored technology because he believed innovation should solve real problems before creating extraordinary profits. Instead, he partnered with universities and independent researchers willing to continue the work openly and responsibly. Lily often smiled whenever reporters asked her what it felt like to watch her father prove everyone wrong. Her answer never changed. He was never trying to prove people wrong, she would say. He was trying to finish something that deserved another chance. Those words quietly spread across newspapers, podcasts, and engineering conferences until they became almost as memorable as the remarkable machine itself. On a peaceful autumn evening, after the last customer had driven away, Ethan locked the garage and stood outside with Lily beneath a sky glowing orange over the Oklahoma horizon. The row of abandoned vehicles that had once filled the parking lot was gone. Their purpose had been fulfilled. Lily slipped her hand into her father's and looked toward the restored prototype resting inside the garage. "Do you ever wish people had believed you from the beginning?" she asked. Ethan looked across the quiet street, where fallen leaves drifted gently in the evening breeze. He smiled with the peaceful confidence that had never depended on anyone else's approval. "No," he answered softly, "because if they had, they might have missed the most important lesson." He glanced back toward the humble garage that had become a place of hope instead of doubt. "People thought I bought 17 broken cars," he said. "What I really found was 17 forgotten opportunities waiting for someone willing to look beyond appearances. And perhaps that is how quiet dignity changes the world. Not through loud victories or proud speeches, but through patient hands, honest work, and the courage to recognize value long before anyone else can see it." Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories of courage, kindness, and second chances, because the people the world overlooks often leave the greatest impact.